Imagine lying on a wooden table, fully awake, while a barber surgeon saws through your leg bone in 28 seconds. No drugs, no mercy. Just 4 men holding you down as you scream. This was a good day in Tudor medicine. The bad days? Your royal physician mixed mercury with a fasting man's spit, forced you to swallow it for 6 weeks until your teeth fell out and your kidneys failed. And if you survived that, they'd drill holes in your skull to let the demons out. Welcome to the deadliest era in medical history, where the cure was always worse than the disease. Hit subscribe, because what you're about to discover will make you grateful for modern medicine. This is how Tudor doctors tortured their patients in the name of healing. In 1540, Henry VIII signed a royal charter that would seal the fate of countless patients for generations. This document placed university-trained physicians at the absolute top of England's medical hierarchy, granting them exclusive rights to diagnose illness and prescribe internal medicines. Below them stood the barber surgeons, skilled with blades, but forbidden from treating anything they couldn't see with their eyes. At the bottom crawled the apothecaries, mere shopkeepers mixing whatever the physicians ordered. This rigid system meant that when you fell ill in Tudor England, your life depended entirely on which rung of this ladder could reach you. For royalty, only the finest university physicians would do. These men had spent years at Oxford or Cambridge, studying ancient Greek and Roman texts, memorizing the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates as if they were holy scripture. They wore long velvet robes and spoke in Latin, never dirtying their hands with actual surgery or physical examination. Their entire understanding of the human body rested on a single theory that was already 1,400 years old: the 4 humors. Every Tudor physician believed the human body contained 4 vital fluids. Blood, hot and wet, flowed from the heart. Phlegm, cold and wet, descended from the brain. Yellow bile, hot and dry, churned in the liver. Black bile, cold and dry, pooled in the spleen. When these 4 humors existed in perfect balance, you enjoyed good health. When they tipped out of alignment, disease took hold. This wasn't theory to them. This was observable fact, as certain as gravity, as real as the sun rising each morning. The implications were terrifying. If your humors were unbalanced, the physician's job was to force them back into harmony through any means necessary. Too much blood? It must be drained. Too much phlegm? Induce vomiting. Excess bile? Purge the bowels until nothing remained. The sicker you were, the more aggressive the rebalancing needed to be. A slight fever might require gentle bleeding. A serious infection demanded radical intervention. Henry VIII himself fancied himself a medical expert. He maintained a personal recipe book filled with treatments for various ailments, spending hours in his private chambers mixing ointments and discussing humoral theory with his physicians. He genuinely believed he understood the mechanisms of disease, that his royal education made him qualified to prescribe remedies not just for himself, but for his courtiers. When his leg ulcers developed in 1537, he took active control of his own treatment plan, consulting his doctors, but ultimately deciding which procedures would be performed on his body. This wasn't ignorance. This was the cutting edge of Tudor medical science, practiced by the most educated men in England on the most important patients in the realm. Every decision made perfect sense within their framework of understanding. They had no reason to doubt theories that had survived since ancient Rome, and that unshakable confidence in a fundamentally wrong system would lead to suffering beyond imagination. The most trusted cure in the Tudor physician's arsenal was also the simplest: remove the bad blood. If humoral theory was the foundation of medical understanding, then bloodletting was its primary application. Every physician learned to identify which vein to open for which ailment. Fever in the head? Open the cephalic vein in the temple. Chest pain? The basilic vein in the arm. Stomach troubles? The saphenous vein in the ankle. Complex charts mapped the human body like a river system, each tributary carrying its own type of corrupted humor that needed draining. The procedure itself seemed almost routine. A physician would tie a leather strap around the limb, wait for the vein to swell with pressure, then make a precise cut with a lancet. Blood would pour into a brass bowl, measured carefully by the ounce. For minor complaints, they might take 8 ounces. For serious illness, 16. For conditions deemed life-threatening, they would drain until the patient's pulse weakened and their face turned pale, believing this indicated the diseased blood had finally been purged. Henry VIII submitted to bleeding throughout his reign, but his leg ulcers presented a special challenge. These weeping wounds on both legs began as jousting injuries, but never properly healed, growing larger and more putrid with each passing year. His physicians believed the ulcers were the body's way of expelling excess blood and bad humors through the skin, a natural safety valve that must be kept open. Whenever the wounds showed signs of closing, doctors would deliberately reopen them, insert drainage tubes, and bleed the surrounding tissue to maintain the flow. The king endured this for over a decade. Court records describe him sitting for hours while physicians worked on his legs, the smell of infection filling his private chambers. They used techniques beyond simple vein cutting. Cupping involved heating glass vessels and placing them on the skin, creating suction that drew blood to the surface. Wet cupping added small incisions beneath the cups, allowing blood to pool inside the glass domes. Leeches served the same purpose, their bodies swelling as they fed, each one capable of consuming half an ounce before dropping off naturally. The practice reached its horrifying peak during emergencies. When King Charles II suffered a stroke decades later, his physicians gathered for a final desperate treatment. Over the course of his death, they drained 24 ounces of blood from his body while he lay paralyzed and helpless. They believed until his last breath that they were buying him time, that one more bleeding might restore the balance. He died anyway, likely faster than if they had done nothing at all. Yet no Tudor physician ever questioned whether removing vast quantities of blood from already weakened patients might be harmful. The theory was too elegant, too logical. Disease caused bad blood. Bad blood must be removed. The math was perfect. The results were devastating. If bloodletting represented the most common Tudor treatment, mercury represented the most feared. The French pox had arrived in England during the late 1400s, spreading through royal courts with terrifying speed. Today we call it syphilis, but to Tudor physicians, it was simply another humoral imbalance requiring aggressive correction. Unfortunately, the correction they devised was worse than the disease itself. Mercury seemed like a logical choice. This liquid metal possessed almost magical properties, neither solid nor liquid in the traditional sense, capable of dissolving gold and silver. Physicians reasoned that if mercury could break down precious metals, it must possess the power to break down disease within the body. They were catastrophically wrong, but their confidence never wavered. The standard treatment protocol lasted 6 weeks and followed a precise ritual. The patient was confined to a sealed room, kept deliberately hot, sometimes with fires burning continuously to maintain sweltering temperatures. They received mercury in various forms, rubbed into the skin as an ointment, inhaled as vapor, or swallowed as pills. The most disturbing preparation involved mixing mercury powder with the saliva of a man who had been fasting for 3 days, creating a paste that physicians believed carried special purifying properties. Within days, the mercury began its assault on the patient's body. The mouth provided the first warning signs. Gums turned bright red and began to swell, becoming so tender that eating caused agony. Then the teeth loosened in their sockets, sometimes falling out entirely, leaving bloody gaps. Saliva production increased dramatically, forcing patients to constantly spit into bowls, their mouths producing up to 3 pints of fluid daily. The breath took on a distinctive metallic stench that announced their treatment to anyone nearby. But the visible symptoms masked the true damage occurring inside. Mercury attacked the kidneys with particular brutality, causing permanent destruction that physicians interpreted as the disease being expelled through urine. Patients developed violent tremors in their hands, lost coordination, and experienced episodes of confusion or rage as the metal accumulated in their brain tissue. Some went completely mad, requiring restraints as they thrashed and screamed, convinced insects were crawling beneath their skin. The cruelest irony was that syphilis itself, while serious, progressed slowly over years or even decades. Many infected people lived relatively normal lives for long periods before the disease advanced. Mercury treatment, however, could kill within months. Those who survived the full 6-week protocol often suffered permanent kidney damage, neurological problems, and complete loss of teeth. A dark saying emerged among those familiar with the treatment: a night with Venus and a lifetime with Mercury. Yet physicians continued prescribing it with absolute conviction. When patients died during treatment, doctors blamed the disease for being too advanced, never the remedy itself. When patients survived but remained damaged, physicians credited the mercury with saving their lives from an even worse fate. The possibility that they were poisoning people never entered serious consideration. A true test of any medical system lies in its results, and Tudor medicine failed its most important patients with alarming consistency. 3 royal deaths in particular reveal how the era's most educated physicians stood helpless, their treatments accelerating decline rather than preventing it. Prince Arthur Tudor, heir to the English throne, fell ill in April 1502 at Ludlow Castle. He was just 15 years old, newly married to Catherine of Aragon, with an entire dynasty resting on his shoulders. The illness struck suddenly, what contemporaries called the sweating sickness, a mysterious disease that killed within hours. Arthur's physicians rushed to his bedside, armed with every tool their training provided. They likely bled him to reduce his fever, administered purgatives to cleanse his system, and kept him in a hot room to encourage sweating, believing this would expel the disease through his pores. Within days, the prince was dead. His physicians recorded their confusion in letters, unable to explain why their interventions had failed so completely. 50 years later, Edward VI lay dying in Greenwich Palace at age 15, the same age Arthur had been. This boy king had inherited his father Henry VIII's throne, but not his constitution. Through the spring of 1553, Edward's health collapsed with mysterious speed. His hair fell out, his skin developed dark patches, his fingers and toes swelled grotesquely. Modern analysis of his symptoms suggests something more sinister than natural disease: the treatments themselves. Court records show physicians administering medicines containing arsenic, lead, and mercury in various combinations, following recipes from trusted medical texts. Edward grew steadily worse, developing total vision loss and episodes of violent confusion. His doctors increased the doses, believing stronger medicine was needed for such aggressive illness. The boy king died in July, his body destroyed by toxins his caretakers had poured into him with loving intention. Between these two tragedies came Mary Tudor's mysterious affliction. Henry VIII's eldest daughter suffered throughout her adult life from symptoms that baffled every physician who examined her. She experienced episodes where her vision failed completely, leaving her blind for days at a time. Her abdomen swelled so dramatically that observers believed she was pregnant, though no child ever came. She endured crushing headaches, fits of depression, and periods of mental confusion that left her unable to recognize familiar faces. Physicians treated her with the full arsenal of Tudor medicine: bleeding, purging, medicinal wines laced with heavy metals. Nothing helped. Modern historians suspect her symptoms resulted from the very treatments meant to cure her. A slow poisoning spread across decades. These weren't isolated failures. They were the inevitable outcome of a medical system built on beautiful theory and catastrophic practice. The best physicians in England, treating the most important patients with unlimited resources, achieved results indistinguishable from doing nothing at all. Often, they achieved something far worse. and the most brutal procedures hadn't even begun yet. While physicians theorized about humors in their velvet robes, the barber surgeons lived in a different world entirely. Their workspace was in a quiet chamber filled with medical texts, but a blood-soaked room where speed meant the difference between survival and death. In Tudor England, surgical skill was measured by a single terrifying metric: how fast you could remove a limb before your patient died from shock. The problem was brutally simple. There existed no reliable way to stop a patient from feeling pain. Alcohol could dull the senses slightly, but a truly drunk patient became uncontrollable and might vomit during the procedure, risking choking. Opium existed, but remained rare and expensive, reserved for only the wealthiest patients, and even then, it merely reduced agony rather than eliminating it. Some surgeons experimented with compression techniques, pressing on major arteries to restrict blood flow to the limb and supposedly reduce sensation. It didn't work. The patient felt everything. This meant every amputation became a race against consciousness itself. A surgeon had perhaps 2 minutes, maybe 3 if the patient was exceptionally strong-willed, before shock or blood loss caused the body to shut down completely. The procedure demanded ruthless efficiency. 4 strong assistants held the patient against the wooden table, 1 on each limb, their entire job to prevent thrashing that could turn a clean cut into a butchered mess. A 5th assistant stood ready with tourniquets and hot irons. The surgeon worked with practiced precision. 1 motion to slice through skin and muscle down to the bone. A 2nd to push back the flesh, exposing the white surface beneath. Then the saw, biting through bone in rapid strokes while the patient's screams echoed off stone walls. The fastest surgeons developed legendary reputations. Robert Liston, though he worked slightly after the Tudor period, became famous for amputating a leg in 28 seconds flat. Speed was celebrated because speed was mercy. But speed also created its own horrors. In the rush to finish before the patient passed out or died, mistakes happened with disturbing frequency. Liston himself once moved so quickly that he accidentally sawed off 3 of his assistants' fingers along with the patient's leg. Another time, he amputated the wrong leg entirely, then had to immediately remove the correct one while the patient remained conscious, having already endured the first surgery. One surgeon forgot his saw blade inside the amputated limb and only discovered the missing tool when he reached for it to start his next operation. The barber surgeons weren't cruel men. Many genuinely cared for their patients and took pride in their craft. But they operated in an impossible situation, trying to perform delicate, life-saving work on fully conscious people who experienced every slice, every crack of bone, every moment of indescribable pain. And amputation was only the beginning. Once the limb was removed, a new nightmare began. The raw stump left behind presented a problem that had plagued surgeons since ancient times: how to seal the wound and stop the bleeding before the patient died from blood loss. Tudor surgeons had developed a solution that was both effective and absolutely horrific. They burned the flesh closed with red-hot iron. The cautery irons hung in a brazier beside the operating table, heating throughout the procedure until they glowed orange in the dim light. These weren't delicate surgical instruments, but thick metal rods with flat ends, designed to cover maximum surface area with each application. The assistant would pull one from the coals, testing its heat by holding it near his face to feel the radiating warmth, then hand it to the surgeon, who pressed it directly against the exposed tissue. The sound came first. A wet hissing as moisture in the flesh instantly vaporized, followed by a crackling pop as fats beneath the skin liquefied. Then the smell, an odor that every account describes as unforgettable. Burning meat mixed with singed hair and something else, something distinctly human that separated it from any kitchen fire. The smoke rose in thick gray clouds, filling the room with a haze that stung the eyes and caught in the throat. For the patient, if they remained conscious, this moment surpassed even the amputation itself. The saw had been quick. a sharp agony that the mind could almost comprehend. But the burning continued. Iron after iron pulled from the fire and applied to different sections of the wound, each touch deliberate and prolonged to ensure complete sealing. Some patients who had remained stoic through the cutting finally broke during cauterization, their screams reaching a pitch that made experienced surgeons wince. Not all surgeons relied solely on fire. Some preferred alternative methods, pouring boiling oil directly into the wound or applying mixtures of turpentine and wine that burned chemically rather than with heat. A few progressive practitioners experimented with ligatures, tying off blood vessels with silk thread instead of burning them shut. But these techniques required more time and skill, luxuries that battlefield surgeons rarely possessed. The hot iron remained standard because it worked quickly and reliably, sealing both blood vessels and potential infection routes in one brutal stroke. The scars left behind told their own story. Cauterized tissue healed differently than natural wounds, creating thick, rope-like bands of scar tissue that pulled and twisted the remaining flesh. Many amputees lived the rest of their lives with stumps that ached constantly, the nerve endings trapped in burned tissue sending false pain signals for decades. But they lived, which was more than could be said for those who bled out on the table or died from shock before the irons could finish their work. In Tudor surgery, survival justified any method, no matter how severe the cost. Of all the procedures in the Tudor surgical repertoire, none approached the audacity of trepanation. This was the practice of boring holes directly through the skull into the living brain, and it had been performed for thousands of years before the Tudor-Era. What made it remarkable wasn't its age, but the fact that surgeons continued performing it despite having almost no understanding of what they were actually doing. The justifications varied depending on the patient's symptoms. A soldier struck in the head during battle might need trepanation to relieve pressure from bleeding beneath the bone. Someone suffering from persistent headaches or seizures could receive it to release trapped vapors that physicians believed caused the pain. Most disturbingly, patients displaying signs of mental illness or erratic behavior might find themselves strapped to a chair while a surgeon, prepared to drill into their skull to let the demons out. The tool itself resembled a carpenter's drill, a T-shaped device with a circular cutting blade at the bottom. The surgeon would select a spot on the scalp, usually wherever the patient reported the most pain, and begin turning the handle. The blade bit into skin first, then scraped against bone, creating a distinctive grinding sound that everyone in the room could hear. The patient certainly heard it, conducted directly through their skull bones into their inner ear, a vibration they felt as much as heard. Progress was measured in fractions of inches over long minutes. The surgeon had to maintain steady pressure while rotating the handle, boring down through layers of increasingly dense bone. Too much pressure risked punching through suddenly and damaging the brain beneath. Too little meant the blade would skate across the surface without cutting. Experienced surgeons developed a feel for the work, sensing the subtle change in resistance that indicated they were nearly through. The breakthrough moment was unmistakable. The blade would suddenly sink slightly, and sometimes there was a small release of air that had been trapped beneath the bone, creating a soft hissing sound. In cases where bleeding had occurred under the skull, dark blood would well up through the hole, which physicians interpreted as proof that the procedure was working, that they were draining the excess humors causing the problem. Prince Philip of Orange underwent this procedure 17 times throughout his life for recurring head pain. Another documented patient received 52 trepanation holes over the course of just 2 months, their skull resembling a piece of riddled parchment by the end. Many patients survived, which seemed to validate the technique. That they might have survived without the drilling, or that their symptoms rarely improved afterward, didn't diminish surgical enthusiasm for the procedure. The holes never fully closed. They remained as permanent windows in the skull, covered only by scalp tissue, creating vulnerable spots that required careful protection for the rest of the patient's life. But Tudor surgeons considered this a small price for treating conditions they otherwise had no ability to address. The combination of extreme time pressure, conscious patience, and primitive tools created an environment where errors were inevitable. What distinguished Tudor surgery from modern practice wasn't just the absence of anesthesia or antiseptics, but the shocking frequency with which preventable mistakes occurred, often with lethal consequences. Record-keeping from the era reveals a pattern of mishaps that would be considered criminal negligence today. Surgical instruments disappeared inside patients with disturbing regularity. Saws broke mid-procedure, leaving metal fragments embedded in bone. Cautery irons, grabbed hastily from the brazier, were sometimes not hot enough to properly seal vessels, requiring multiple applications that extended the torture. Other times they were too hot, causing tissue to char and crumble rather than forming the tough scar needed to close the wound. Communication breakdowns compounded these technical failures. In the chaos of restraining a thrashing patient, assistants sometimes misunderstood which limb required amputation. By the time the error was discovered, the wrong leg or arm had already been removed, forcing the surgeon to immediately proceed with amputating the correct one. The patient, having already endured one complete surgery, now faced a second while still bleeding from the first. Survival rates in these cases dropped to nearly zero. The assistants themselves suffered their own catalog of injuries. Holding down a fully conscious person experiencing unimaginable pain required strength and positioning that put them directly in the surgical field. Fingers got caught under blades. Hands slipped into the path of saws. One documented case describes an assistant who was knocked completely unconscious when a patient's head struck him during a seizure caused by shock. The surgery continued with one fewer person to restrain the patient, making an already dangerous situation catastrophic. Infection, though not understood in Tudor times, claimed more lives than surgical errors. Every instrument, every hand, every cloth used during the procedure carried invisible contamination. Surgeons moved directly from one patient to the next without washing, proud of the bloodstains on their aprons as proof of their experience. The same saws cut through multiple people in a single day. Wounds that appeared to heal successfully in the first week would suddenly turn red and hot, beginning to leak fluid that smelled of rot. Within days, the patient developed fever, then delirium, then death. Yet the surgeons genuinely believed they were doing their best work. They had no concept of germs, no way to understand that their hands were weapons. Speed, confidence, and a steady grip were the qualities they cultivated, and by those standards, many were indeed masters of their craft. The system itself was broken, built on incomplete knowledge and impossible working conditions. Every surgery was a gamble, every patient a test of luck as much as skill. And waiting beyond the surgical theater were the physicians with their poison cabinets, ready to treat the survivors with remedies that often proved more dangerous than the original injury. Tudor medicine didn't just cut and burn the body. It also tried to heal from the inside with some of the strangest ingredients imaginable. While surgeons worked in bloody theaters, royal physicians and apothecaries built their own kind of torture chamber in glass bottles, ointment pots, and powdered remedies. To them, nothing in nature was off limits if it might shift the body's humors back into balance. Animal fat, metals, herbs, wine, even parts of foxes and spiders were all fair game, as long as the theory behind the mixture sounded convincing. Henry VIII's own household is the perfect example. The king kept a personal collection of medicinal recipes, many designed for his chronic leg ulcers and joint pain. These weren't gentle herbal teas. They were thick pastes and washes made from ingredients chosen to dry, heat, or cool the flesh according to humoral rules. One mixture might blend honey and oil with ground herbs to draw out bad humors through the skin. Another might use vinegar and wine to cut through perceived excess moisture in swollen tissue. The king liked to discuss these concoctions with his physicians as if he were a fellow expert, approving ingredients and sometimes suggesting additions himself. The animals of Tudor England paid their own price for royal health. Foxes were boiled down into an oil believed to have powerful healing and warming properties, especially for aches and pains in the limbs. A small bottle of fox oil could sit alongside jars of bear grease, pig fat, and deer suet, each assigned a particular effect on the body. Spider webs, gathered carefully from dark corners, were pressed into service as a kind of natural bandage. When sweating sickness or fever struck, some healers used webs and remedies intended to draw out illness or seal small wounds, trusting more in the symbol of the spider's web than any real understanding of infection. Even everyday foods became part of this internal battlefield. Honey appeared in countless remedies, not just for its sweetness, but because it was considered cleansing and preserving. Cow's milk might be prescribed for complaints linked to riding or hemorrhoids, its cooling, soothing nature supposedly calming inflamed tissue after long hours on horseback. Wine played a double role, both as a disinfecting wash for wounds and as a base for medicinal infusions, carrying powdered herbs and minerals into the bloodstream with every swallow. To a Tudor patient, medicine could look and taste like a bizarre feast. What ties all these treatments together is the same unwavering confidence seen in the bloodletting room and surgical theater. Royal patients trusted that these strange brews and salves were the height of medical science, crafted by the smartest men in the kingdom and sometimes by the king himself. No one questioned whether fox oil, spider webs, or heavily spiced wines were doing more harm than good. The next step would be darker still, when these odd ingredients were joined by truly toxic substances that could slowly destroy a royal body from within, while everyone at court believed they were watching a cure take effect. The strangest ingredients were merely uncomfortable or useless. The truly dangerous medicines came from the earth itself, heavy metals and minerals that Tudor physicians believed possessed extraordinary healing power. These substances didn't just fail to cure disease. They created new ones, slowly destroying organs while doctors mistook the damage for signs of the original illness fighting back. Calomel became one of the most prescribed medications in the royal pharmacopoeia. This white powder, made from mercury chloride, served as a powerful purgative meant to cleanse the intestines of excess bile and corrupted humors. Physicians called it the Samson of medicine for its strength, administering it in doses that triggered violent cramping and diarrhea lasting for hours. Patients lost dangerous amounts of fluid, weakening their bodies precisely when they needed strength to fight actual disease. Worse, the mercury content accumulated in tissue over time, especially with repeated treatments. A patient given calomel monthly for chronic digestive complaints might suffer kidney damage within a year, never knowing their trusted remedy was the source of their decline. Lead appeared in medicines with frightening frequency, often disguised in compounds with pleasant-sounding names. White lead mixed into face powders and skin ointments promised to clear complexion problems and reduce inflammation. Taken internally as a tonic, lead acetate was supposed to strengthen the blood and calm nervous conditions. The reality was neurological damage that crept forward with each dose. Patients developed tremors in their hands, complained of persistent headaches, experienced mood swings that ranged from depression to sudden rage. Physicians noted these symptoms, but attributed them to the patient's underlying condition worsening, not to the medicine itself. Zinc and arsenic joined this toxic arsenal, each with its own supposed benefits. Zinc compounds mixed with rosewater and wine created a drinkable tonic that physicians believed could restore vitality and balance all four humors simultaneously. The wine masked the metallic taste, making it easier for patients to swallow doses large enough to cause gastric distress and liver stress. Arsenic, in carefully measured amounts, was thought to improve skin conditions and act as a general strengthening agent. The line between a therapeutic dose and a poisonous one was razor thin, and many physicians crossed it without realizing. The cruelest aspect of these toxic treatments was their slow action. Unlike surgery, where results appeared immediately, these medicines worked over weeks and months. A patient might feel initial relief, possibly from the placebo effect, or from their body naturally recovering despite the medicine. But as treatments continued, new symptoms emerged: fatigue, confusion, organ pain. Physicians responded by increasing doses or adding new compounds, certain that more aggressive treatment was needed. The patient, trusting their doctor completely, swallowed every prescription without question. Royal courts witnessed this pattern repeatedly. Young men in perfect health would begin taking preventive tonics and decline steadily over months. Women treated for minor complaints would develop mysterious new ailments that seemed to spread through their bodies. And through it all, the physicians kept detailed records, noting symptoms and adjusting formulas, never suspecting they were creating the very diseases they claimed to fight. Henry VIII's leg ulcers presented a unique medical challenge that led physicians down one of their strangest therapeutic paths. The wounds refused to heal normally, remaining open and weeping for years, despite every conventional treatment. Rather than accepting this as a failure of their methods, royal doctors developed a theory that turned medical logic on its head. The ulcers were actually protecting the king's life and must be kept open deliberately. The reasoning followed humoral principles to their most extreme conclusion. Physicians observed that when the leg wounds began to close naturally, Henry's overall health seemed to worsen. He would develop headaches, mood disturbances, and feelings of pressure in his chest. To the medical mind of the era, this pattern revealed an obvious truth. The king's body contained an excess of bad humors that needed a route of escape. The ulcers served as natural drainage points, safety valves releasing corruption that would otherwise build up internally and cause far worse damage to vital organs. This interpretation led to a treatment approach called counter-irritation. Instead of helping the wounds heal, physicians actively worked to keep them inflamed and draining. They would insert small tubes or reeds into the ulcers to maintain open channels. When tissue began forming over the wounds, doctors would scrape it away or apply caustic substances that prevented proper closure. The goal was maintaining chronic, controlled inflammation that kept the drainage flowing steadily. The daily management of these wounds became a royal ritual. Henry would sit while his physicians cleaned the ulcers, applied fresh irritants, and wrapped them in bandages designed to absorb discharge without allowing the openings to seal. The smell was notorious throughout the court, a constant reminder of the king's condition that no amount of perfume could fully mask. Courtiers learned to position themselves upwind during audiences, though no one dared mention the odor directly. What makes this treatment particularly tragic is that it likely created a self-fulfilling prophecy. By preventing natural healing and maintaining constant irritation, physicians ensured the wounds would never close properly. The chronic inflammation they deliberately caused weakened surrounding tissue, damaged blood flow to the area, and created ideal conditions for persistent infection. When Henry's health declined in other ways, it probably had more to do with years of chronic infection slowly poisoning his system than with any mystical buildup of internal humors. Yet the theory remained unquestioned because it seemed to work within its own framework. Keep the ulcers open, and the king survived. Allow them to close, and he felt worse, possibly because his body was finally trying to fight the infection without an easy drainage route. Physicians interpreted every outcome as confirmation of their approach, never considering that they might be perpetuating the very problem they claimed to manage. This same logic extended to other patients with chronic wounds or skin conditions. If you couldn't cure the problem, maintain it carefully. Turn disease into a permanent feature of the body, managed rather than eliminated, and call it successful treatment. The terrifying reality of Tudor medicine revealed itself most clearly in cases where patients declined faster under care than they likely would have without any intervention at all. These weren't dramatic surgical failures where death came quickly on the operating table. Instead, they were slow erosions of health, weeks or months of steady deterioration, while physicians administered remedy after remedy, each one pushing the patient closer to the grave. Edward V's final months provide the clearest documentation of treatment-induced decline. Court records and diplomatic letters tracked his symptoms with unusual detail because the entire kingdom watched anxiously for news of their young king's health. In early 1553, Edward was weak but stable. By spring, observers noted alarming changes. His hair began falling out in patches. His skin took on strange dark discolorations. His fingers and toes swelled grotesquely, and he complained of feeling like his body was on fire from the inside. Modern medical historians examining these symptoms see the signature of heavy metal poisoning, specifically the combination of arsenic, lead, and continued mercury exposure from multiple medications. Each substance alone might have been survivable at the doses prescribed. Together, they created a toxic cocktail that attacked every major organ system simultaneously. Edward's kidneys began failing, causing the swelling in his extremities. His liver struggled to process the accumulating poisons, leading to the skin changes. The neurological effects manifested as confusion, vision problems, and eventually the complete blindness that marked his final weeks. His physicians, seeing their patient worsen, did exactly what their training dictated. They increased treatment intensity. If current medicines weren't working, stronger doses must be needed. If one compound showed limited effect, adding others would surely help. They were utterly sincere in their efforts, staying by Edward's bedside through long nights, preparing fresh remedies, consulting ancient texts for overlooked treatments. Every intervention came from genuine concern and the best medical knowledge available. And every intervention made things worse. The progression followed a predictable pattern seen in other cases of treatment poisoning. Initial symptoms brought initial treatments. Those treatments caused new symptoms, interpreted as the disease spreading or intensifying. More aggressive treatments followed, accelerating the damage. The patient's body, already fighting the original illness, now had to battle the cumulative effects of multiple toxic substances, while simultaneously being bled and purged of vital fluids and nutrients. What made this cycle nearly impossible to break was the fundamental assumption underlying all Tudor medicine, that trained physicians possessed special knowledge of the body's inner workings. When a patient died despite treatment, it proved the disease was too powerful, not that the treatment was harmful. When a patient suffered new symptoms during treatment, it showed the illness was worse than initially believed, not that the medicine was causing damage. No system of peer review existed to challenge these conclusions. No statistical analysis compared outcomes between treated and untreated patients. The framework itself was closed, self-confirming, and utterly convinced of its own correctness. And that certainty would shape royal health for generations. Henry VIII, his transformation from athletic young king to immobile invalid, provides a decades-long case study in how Tudor medicine interacted with royal health. The trajectory wasn't simply age or natural disease. It was a complex interplay between genuine injuries, chronic infections, and years of continuous medical intervention that may have accelerated rather than slowed his physical collapse. In 1536, Henry was still an imposing physical presence, 45 years old and active in tournaments despite his size. Then came the jousting accident that changed everything. A fully armored opponent's horse fell on him, crushing him beneath over 1,000 pounds of metal and horseflesh. He lay unconscious for 2 hours, and when he woke, the injuries to his legs were severe. The wounds penetrated deep into muscle tissue, and within weeks, infection had set in. This was the moment his physicians stepped in with their arsenal of treatments. The leg wounds never healed properly from that point forward. Within a year, the first ulcers had developed, open sores that wept continuously and filled the air around the king with their distinctive smell. His doctors immediately began their management protocol: regular bleeding of the affected areas, application of various ointments and poultices, and the counter-irritation approach that kept the wounds deliberately inflamed. By 1540, just 4 years after the initial injury, Henry required a walking staff for support. His mobility had been cut in half. The decline accelerated with remarkable consistency. A 1541 description by the French ambassador painted a picture of a man whose body was betraying him in multiple ways. Henry had grown enormously heavy, his flesh described as excessive and unhealthy. Yet his digestion remained perfect, suggesting his appetite was strong, even as his body struggled with the consequences of size and immobility. Most tellingly, the ambassador noted the king's temperament had shifted dramatically. Mood swings, sudden rages, periods of depression, all characteristics that emerged alongside his medical treatments. By 1542, Henry could no longer manage stairs without mechanical assistance. Court engineers designed elaborate pulley systems and ramps to move the king between floors of his palaces. The man who had once competed in jousting tournaments now needed to be hoisted like cargo. His legs could barely support his weight, not because of the original injury alone, but because years of keeping wounds open, repeated bleeding, and constant inflammation had destroyed the tissue's integrity. The very treatments meant to preserve his health had rendered him progressively more disabled. Yet through all of this, Henry maintained absolute faith in his physicians. He consulted them daily, discussed treatments, and even contributed his own ideas based on his amateur medical studies. He never questioned whether the decade of continuous care might be contributing to his decline. The possibility simply didn't exist within his worldview. Doctors healed. Disease destroyed. Those were the only two forces in play, and he knew which side his physicians were on, even as their careful management slowly dismantled his body, piece by piece. Beyond the physical damage, Tudor medical treatment inflicted a unique form of psychological suffering that modern patients can barely imagine. The terror wasn't just about pain, though that was certainly present. It was about anticipation, helplessness, and the knowledge that the people who controlled your body believed they were helping you even as they caused immense harm. Consider the experience of a patient scheduled for amputation. Unlike modern surgery where anesthesia provides merciful unconsciousness, Tudor patients lived with full awareness of what was coming. Days, sometimes weeks of knowing that assistants would soon hold you down while a surgeon sawed through your bone. You couldn't escape. You couldn't refuse if your physician deemed it necessary. You could only wait, imagining the moment over and over, each mental rehearsal building dread that had nowhere to go. The waiting extended to other treatments as well. Patients undergoing mercury therapy knew they faced 6 weeks of confinement in sweltering rooms, 6 weeks of watching their teeth loosen and their minds fog. They experienced the first symptoms and understood they would get worse before any supposed improvement came. Each day brought new deterioration they could track in mirrors or by running their tongue over increasingly unstable teeth. The psychological weight of watching your own body break down, knowing you were only halfway through the prescribed treatment, created a special kind of despair. Repeated bloodletting carried its own mental burden. After the first session left you weak and dizzy, you knew more were coming. Your physician had scheduled them, marked them on a calendar, and would carry them out regardless of how you felt. The powerlessness was absolute. You might dread the next bleeding, might feel your strength hadn't returned from the last one, but your opinion held no weight against medical authority. The knife would open your vein on schedule, and you would watch your blood pour into the basin again, feeling your energy drain away in measured ounces. Some patients developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of severe anxiety or trauma. They became agitated at the sight of their physicians, their bodies responding to the approach of caregivers with the same fear response others showed to enemies. Sleep became difficult, disrupted by nightmares of past procedures or terror about future ones. Appetite vanished, not from illness, but from constant stress that knotted stomachs and made eating impossible. Henry VIII's documented mood changes in his later years included sudden rages and periods of deep melancholy that mystified his courtiers. Modern analysis points to possible brain damage from his jousting injuries or effects of chronic infection. But there is another factor rarely considered: the psychological impact of living for a decade under constant medical intervention. Daily wound treatments, regular bleeding, the endless parade of physicians examining and discussing his body as if he were a puzzle to solve rather than a person to comfort. The human mind isn't designed to endure prolonged medical procedures while fully conscious, especially when those procedures cause significant pain and rarely bring improvement. Tudor patients didn't just suffer physically. They suffered mentally, trapped in a system that gave them no voice and no escape. A most tragic aspect of royal medical care wasn't simply that it was harmful. It was that the very structure of Tudor society made it nearly impossible for high-status patients to seek alternatives, even when treatments clearly weren't working. A complex web of law, social hierarchy, and professional monopoly trapped royals and nobles in a system that prioritized credential over outcome. The 1540 Royal Charter formalized what had been evolving for decades: a strict medical hierarchy with university-educated physicians at the pinnacle. These men, trained in Latin and ancient Greek texts at Oxford or Cambridge, held exclusive legal authority to diagnose internal diseases and prescribe remedies that patients would swallow or absorb. This wasn't just professional courtesy. It was law, backed by the crown's power and enforceable through courts. Below them, barber surgeons occupied a carefully defined middle ground. They could cut, saw, pull teeth, and perform external procedures, but the moment a treatment involved internal medicine, they had to defer to a physician's judgment. An experienced barber surgeon might have decades of practical knowledge about wound healing and infection, but he legally could not prescribe a simple herbal tea without a physician's approval. The system valued theoretical education over practical results. At the bottom existed the folk healers, the cunning women and village-wise people who had treated common people for generations using herbal remedies and traditional knowledge. The same 1540 charter that elevated physicians also criminalized these practitioners. Their healing work was rebranded as witchcraft or sorcery, dangerous superstition that threatened both souls and bodies. Nobles who might have quietly consulted such healers in earlier times now risked scandal and accusations of consorting with dark forces. For someone like Henry VIII, this meant his options were completely circumscribed. He couldn't simply dismiss his physicians and try something else. To do so would be to reject the most educated medical minds in his kingdom, an admission that royal judgment was flawed. It would undermine the entire social hierarchy that placed university learning above practical experience. Worse, it might suggest the king believed in folk magic over proper Christian medicine, opening him to criticism from religious authorities. Even if Henry had wanted to seek alternative treatment, where would he turn? The folk healers were criminalized. Foreign physicians might bring different approaches, but they operated under the same humoral theory, just with regional variations. The only option was to keep working within the established system, trying different physicians who all shared the same fundamental training and beliefs. This created a perfect trap. Poor outcomes couldn't be blamed on the medical system itself, only on individual physician skill or the severity of the disease. If one doctor's treatments failed, you consulted another doctor who would prescribe variations on the same basic approaches. The theoretical framework never faced challenge because no alternative framework had legal standing or social legitimacy. Royal patients, despite their wealth and power, were among the most medically trapped people in Tudor England. Their status guaranteed, they would receive the full force of establishment medicine with no possibility of escape. The ultimate proof of Tudor medicine as failure should have been its body count among the very patients who received the most advanced care available. Yet each royal death, rather than prompting reflection on medical methods, only reinforced the system's confidence in itself. The pattern repeated across generations with numbing consistency. Prince Arthur Tudor died in 1502 at Ludlow Castle, surrounded by the finest physicians his father's wealth could summon. They tried everything their training suggested for sweating sickness, keeping him warm to encourage the disease to exit through his pores, administering purgatives to cleanse his system, possibly bleeding him to reduce fever. He died anyway. The physicians wrote detailed reports explaining that the disease had simply been too aggressive, too sudden, beyond any doctor's power to counter. No one suggested that keeping a feverish patient in an overheated room while draining his bodily fluids might have accelerated his death. The conclusion was that they needed better understanding of sweating sickness, not that their fundamental approach was flawed. Henry Fitzroy, Henry VIII's illegitimate son, died in 1536 at age 17. His final illness came on suddenly, characterized by symptoms his doctors found perplexing. They administered the standard arsenal: bleeding, purging, medicinal compounds. He deteriorated rapidly despite their efforts, or perhaps because of them. Modern speculation suggests tuberculosis, but the exact cause remains uncertain. What is certain is that his physicians documented their confusion, their sense that something unexpected had defeated them. They blamed mysterious disease, never their remedies. Edward VI's death in 1553 closed this tragic sequence. The young king had the benefit of 17 years of medical advancement since Fitzroy's death, access to even more trained physicians, and his condition monitored with obsessive detail because the succession depended on his survival. Yet he still died young, his final months marked by symptoms that scream heavy metal poisoning to modern eyes. His doctors recorded everything meticulously, noting each new symptom, each treatment adjustment, each consultation with colleagues. Their records show men genuinely trying to save their king using every tool they possessed. They never recorded doubt about whether their tools might be weapons instead. These deaths should have triggered systematic examination of medical practice. 3 young royals, all receiving optimal care from the era's most credentialed physicians, all dying despite aggressive treatment. But Tudor medicine had no mechanism for self-correction. Each death was treated as an individual tragedy, a case where disease proved stronger than current medical knowledge, not evidence that the knowledge itself was corrupt. The system continued unchanged for generations after Edward's death. The same humoral theories, the same bloodletting and mercury treatments, the same confidence in ancient texts over observed outcomes. Royal patients kept dying under care that was supposed to save them, and each death only reinforced the narrative that disease was powerful and mysterious, requiring even more aggressive intervention in the future. The torture of Tudor royal medicine wasn't just what it did to bodies. It was that the system could never learn from its failures, because it could never admit failure was possible. And so the cycle continued, each generation inheriting deadly certainty disguised as healing wisdom.